God was helping me understand today that we can offer resistance to God's blessings. Like, God could have come and, you could have prayed for something for so long, prayed to God for something, and then when it finally comes, I don't want to say you're in denial that it's God, but because it's like you took that hope away and you chucked it somewhere else. When it finally comes, you're like, nah, I don't want it. Because your hope has been so drained, you resist that blessing. You resist it. You're like, I don't need it. I think it comes from you having the strength to say, I don't need this. I'm fine without it. Because when I needed it so much, I didn't get it. And what's important for us to realize is that our timeline is different from God's timeline. The reason why God makes us wait sometimes is because it's in the waiting that our character is being refined. It's in the waiting where our heart is being tuned to align with God's purpose and with God's plan for our lives. But sometimes we miss it because we want our way. We want things to go the way that we planned. We want things to turn out the way that we decided to say, yeah. This is what I decided things should turn out like, and this is how they're turning out. Of which God doesn't work like that. God wants you as a person to be aligned to His will, because His will is actually the best thing on this planet. If anything, God's will is the best thing on this planet. It says, the Lord's Prayer says, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We hear stories of people who have gone to heaven, and when they say they come back, when they come back, they say that heaven was so beautiful that they didn't want to leave. Why is heaven so beautiful? Because heaven has the perfection of God's will in it. So God's will is beautiful. God's will is sweet. God's will is pure. God's will is holy. And sometimes we miss it. We literally miss that God's will is that powerful. God's will is so powerful because God's perfection. When people go to hell, they say hell is the worst place possible. It's the worst place to be in. Why? Because God's will is not present there. God's good, infinite will for you, your life is not present. It's everything outside of God. God's will is... Everything of God is aligned to God's will. Everything that is outside of God's will is outside of God's identity. So it will not carry God. Because you are created by God. When you go outside, when you go to a place like hell, which is outside of God's will, is the worst place possible, because that place cannot house anything that is of you, because you were created to be of God. Man. So anyways, going back to resisting the things that God has for us because we waited so long. We have this woman. She had the prophet coming over. She set a room in a house. She made sure it was comfortable. But when it was time now, the prophet then asked his servant, he's like, what does she want? He's like, she doesn't have a child. And he prophesies to her, and she says, don't tell me about that. She's like, she's not ready, because her heart had been so hardened to the idea of having a child. Anyways, what happens? She has a child, right? And one day, that child that she got just suddenly dies. The thing that you waited for so long, you finally get it, and it then disappears. She takes that thing. She talks to nobody on the road. She goes straight. She says, I'm going straight to the man of God. She gets there. And she said, didn't I tell you? Didn't I tell you I don't want this thing? Didn't I tell you? Didn't I tell you? Didn't I tell you? Sometimes we go to people and we say, we go to God, and we say, God, didn't I tell you, I don't want this thing anymore? Because it feels as if this thing is falling apart. And it's falling apart within our hands. And we don't know what to do with it. I say, God, didn't I tell you? But God is so good. God is so full of mercy. God is so full of goodness that even though that happens, God still comes through. God still comes through. So what does the prophet do? He goes and he gets upstairs, right, and lays the child and prays of the child. And then breath comes back to a child. What God cannot do does not exist. It doesn't exist. I want you to drive this into your head. What God cannot do doesn't exist. That child woke up from the dead. That child got life. That child began to walk and to speak and to eat and to what? Someone who had been dead. Now, what is it that you prayed for so long? That when it came to you, you resisted it. But when you finally accepted it, it died. What is it that you need to come and bring before God? And say, God, I don't understand why this thing died, but I'm bringing it before you. Because you are God. You're the same God who gave it to me. You are the same God who gave it to me, and I know you're not fail me.